So you guys met Michael before, who came in actually in one of our very first sessions and talked to you about disease state fundamentals and kind of the solution landscape, the very early stages of a project. Welcome back, Michael. As you know, Michael is an alum of our Innovation Fellowship and a founder of multiple companies in devices and biotech. So we're delighted to have you back, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, great to be here.
We are also joined today by Nick Damiano, who is here with us in person. Nick completed the Innovation Fellowship as well. Was that 2015, 16?
13, 14.
13, 14. Okay, you were my first class when I started working full-time at Biodesign. So I guess it's been a while. Nick also took a company forward. Some of you met Shreya Mehta, who came in as one of our regulatory coaches. Shreya and Nick co-founded a company called ZenFlow out of the fellowship, working in the BPH space. Nick has founder experience before then and now subsequently in a third company. And he and Michael are going to give you guys an overview today about the operating plan and financial model.
Today, we're going to talk about a couple of essential tools for any business or any product planning. And that's how to build on the tool side an operating plan and a budget, and then how to assess the total addressable market and essentially what's the revenue potential for this product, and then how profitable is that revenue. So we'll look at how much the costs of goods are, and then you can calculate the gross margin from that. And what's useful here is that these two things together will help you figure out how much it's going to cost over what period of time and what kind of value you could expect at the end. And so that's going to help you and others assess the value of this. And they also happen to be great tools that you can use to manage the team on a go-forward basis too. So I mentioned assessing the value, and that's applying an investor. And so a financial investor is certainly one important party that's going to want to understand this. But actually, you were an investor as well. You guys are all really bright people. You're at Stanford. You have a large opportunity cost, right? So you could do any number of great things. And so you also want to be able to assess, is this opportunity worth investing my time and my energy? And so this is an exercise that will help with that. And then these tools are actually, by definition, they're helping you plan the business, right? And so you're planning the activities, but you're also planning the financing strategy. So we'll talk more about that and how you can use these tools to plan how you're going to raise money around this business. And then the good news is it's not all just a planning exercise. You can actually take these tools into the battlefield and use them to manage your business. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And through this, I'm going to walk you through some of the notions on how to build these things. And Nick is going to walk you through some examples from his real world experience. And we're going to kick it off with the operating plan. So the book's definition is on top, but an operating plan, it's really just a plan of all the things that you need to do to get to commercial launch. And so I think that's for the stage of business that you guys are doing right now. I don't think you need to plan beyond launch. At some point that'll be necessary, but for now you can basically plan up to the commercial launch. And approval if you're looking at a regulated product. So why is this important? Well, because these businesses are complex. It's not a lemonade stand, and so you can't wing it. There's too many moving pieces, and it takes too much money. And again, for the reasons that we talked about, really helping you estimate whether or not this is a good investment for you and for others. Okay, so for the operating plan, we're going to talk about this at two scales. So first is a high-level long-term plan. So you're going to look at the life of the business all the way up until that launch point and figure out what the high-level activities are, what the milestones are, and get them all laid out. And then once we do that, we're also going to talk about a more focused near-term plan. So what it's going to take you to get to this first major milestone through your first financing. And the way that we typically do this is in the form of a Gantt chart. That's probably the most commonly used tool. It's a really effective one. Most of you are probably familiar with that, with what that is, and we'll show you some examples of it. But it's effectively a bar chart where you can kind of label the different activities and put them adjacent to one another. And as I mentioned before, this not only allows you to plan the activities, but also to plan the financings. So as many of you are aware, startup financing occurs around value-driven milestones. So you've probably heard of Series A and Series B and Series C. So the money comes in chunks, right? And so the average, let's say that the average PMA medical device product might be, $150 million to get it all the way to approval. And for a drug, it might be 200. For a class 2 device, it might be, less. So, but all of that money is not going to come in a single, fell swoop saying, hey, I need $150 million to drive this PMA project forward. Instead, it's going to come in smaller pieces, and bigger dollars will come once you've reduced the risk. And so that's happens for a couple of reasons. One, no one's going to give you the $200 million for something that is still largely just an idea. But on the flip side of it is it also allows you to increase the value of the company with each subsequent financing. And so, raising $200 million on, a $1 million pre-money valuation isn't going to leave a lot of ownership left for the founders. But if you're raising, $1 million seed on 1 million or 1 million on 2 or 3, then it allows you to keep ownership, and then you can keep growing the value of the company and be less diluted. So in doing this, Nick will show you how to identify milestones around which you can finance. And so these tend to be key value inflection points, or places where risk has been reduced. So this it could be a technical challenge. We didn't think you could build this thing, and you were able to build it, and you showed that you could. It could be an animal study. It's all right, well, the physiology works in the animal. The ones that are the biggest value driving events tend to be clinical data events or regulatory events. So 3 easy steps. I promise this is simple. So the first is to identify the key activities. You guys are experts at brainstorming now, and I think that's the best way to do this. So whatever brainstorming process you think is best for you and your team, just identify all those key activities. What are all the things that we have to do between now and launch? And maybe you get 20 or 50 up on the board, and you can boil it down to the ones that are the most relevant for this scale. But examples are product development or animal proof of concept, clinical trials, etc. Step 2 is to identify their sequence and timing. And so the tips and tricks here, literally, this is, Nick and I do this for every company. You literally put them all out there, and then you got to figure out how it all fits together. The way that I like to do this the best is actually just create a PowerPoint slide with time going across, and Nick will show you an example of that from his experience. And then you can actually just drag the different key activities around, and you can all talk about it as a team, and you can beat it up, and it provides a really nice live way to do that. So with that, I think we're on to where Nick's going to show you an example.
Yeah, so this example is loosely based on a pathway that I planned out for a prior company and eventually executed on. It turns out when your ideas meet with reality, the timelines, the milestones do change a good bit. So this all looks clean and orderly and very well defined in this format. Then once you meet with the realities of building products and doing clinical trials, especially when your product meets with the human body for the first time, things tend to be a little bit different. But here's roughly a plan that we had built many years back, kind of shifted to as if we were starting in the present year. So the first thing that you usually start with is just building the first version of the device, the Gen 1 device, as you might call it. And then as soon as possible, you want to get that into some kind of preclinical testing, whether that's bench models, cadavers, simulations. In this case, I have it as animal, which is a common type of preclinical testing that a lot of devices have to go through. So here, basically, the first big milestone is, does this thing work in the animal? We built this device, the first version of it. How's it going to do when it meets with some kind of live physiological model? So that's the first value driving milestone. Then usually you have to go back and do some more development. There's things you learn. You have to go and iterate the device, build that second generation. And then ideally, if that all goes well, you can get into clinical trials. So a first in human trial, often that's outside the US. Usually it's a little bit lower bar to get into those trials in other parts of the world, as opposed to dealing with FDA from the get-go, though FDA is making more of an effort to facilitate first in human studies, early feasibility studies in the US. Getting that clinical data is a really key milestone for most companies, showing that, okay, this thing worked in the animal. Then there's always the question, is that going to translate from a rat or a dog or a sheep or whatever you're using into humans? Once you show it works in humans, that builds a lot of value that you can use to raise funding on, and additionally build confidence for the next steps. For most devices, when you're talking about a PMA or high-risk device, usually you're going to need multiple phases of clinical trials. There's often things that you learn from that first trial that you need to then reincorporate into a revised version of the device, and then go into a new clinical study. In this case, I have another international study, and indeed for ZenFlow, we went into, I think, 5 different countries before we went to our first US case. Then once you get that data, if that all looks good and you're confident enough, and I think you want to be really sure before you start a big randomized study, you really need to have that confidence from those early studies that this is working well. We have a good idea what the outcome is going to be. So we're ready to start this big randomized study we're going to use for FDA approval and to launch onto the market. And at that point, you go and file for your IDE, investigational device exemption, with FDA, and then start that big pivotal study, which when that completes, if you hit your endpoints and collect some good data, it's another big value driving milestone that you can then use to go through the FDA process. And in this case, secure your PMA. Other devices may face, as I'm sure you've heard in other lectures, de novos or 510Ks or other pathways. And then tying this into the funding rounds. And I have here, so the first round usually is called a seed round or a pre-seed round. There's all different name now. One thing interesting that's happened in recent years is the seed stage has tended to expand, where lots of companies are raising. This is not just medtech, but tech too, and lots of other verticals are raising multiple seed rounds at different valuations or valuation caps. So I have here the animal study kind of coming in mid-seed round, where you've raised some of the funding, and then you'd probably raise another late seed, or some people say pre-series A, or I think bridge round usually comes into play when you probably haven't hit the milestone. So it is used sometimes for just an extension of a round, where you can then say, okay, we have this proof of concept, we're going to raise in a little bit higher cap on a safe or convertible note at this point. And then a lot of times, at least in the medtech world, from my experience, a lot of the VCs want to see some human data for a device like this before they go and give you a big check for a Series A round. So in this case, that second initial clinical data milestone feeds into this $20 million round. And there's a little bit of gap here you can see between when that happens and when the round's raised. Usually it takes, you want to allow something like 6 months to get that closed. If you're lucky, or if you're good, it can go faster. And there are many cases, and I've been involved in these cases where it drags up beyond, sometimes well beyond 6 months. It's important also to just have some backup, I think, especially between the seed and Series A stage, to be able to have some backup plan where you can possibly raise some money on a safe or convertible note to get you through in case that takes a little bit longer to raise. But in any case, you want to plan to have runway a little bit past when you think you're going to raise the round. And then in this case, so this company's finished its first in human trial, went into a pilot study, maybe did let's say 20 patients in the first in human, then another 50 or so in the pilot, has some really solid data that more investors could get excited, that it feels like it's a little bit more de-risked and more proven. At this point, we feel like we're ready for the pivotal study. So going to go out and raise a Series B, and these pivotal studies can be really expensive. Those of us who have built companies have seen this firsthand, and it's always costs more and takes longer than you think. So here we're going out to raise $40 million in a Series B. Could be some of the same investors, could be other bigger VCs that come in this round. Some VCs specialize in a certain stage. Some say we want pivotal ready products or even commercial ready products to be interested to invest. And then once that next milestone is hit, once the pivotal study is done, we got good data that met our endpoints, and we're going to go and raise a Series C. And this can be a pretty big round, depending how aggressively you want to go and commercialize things, somewhere between, for this kind of product, probably at least 30 million or so, and possibly up to something like 100. And you want to raise that a little bit before you're commercializing. So while you're going through this FDA process, if you have the data and you've done your pre-sub meetings with FDA and kind of aligned on what they're going to want, then hopefully this is a relatively painless process. And then once you raise that round and kind of scale up your sales team while you're going through this FDA review, then you're ready to hit the ground running and get into the commercial market. And there could, of course, be an exit at some point where maybe one of the big med tech companies comes in and wants to acquire you. They like what they see with your data, but you don't want to plan for that because it's, as they say, companies are bought, not sold. It's hard to predict when that might happen or if it might happen.
Yeah, and it'll go right back to Nick in a moment here. I mean, basically, then once you have the long-term plan, you're going to focus on the near-term plan. And this is basically what's going to happen on this first capital raise. This is the plan you would go pitch to those first investors, call it for a seed round or a Series A round. And what's the nuance of how you're going to get that done so that you can make sure that you're actually raising the right amount of money. You've identified all of the key resources, people, et cetera, and then basically do the same thing. So you identify the sequence and timing, and what we'll talk about next is how you can feed these things. Once you have the plan, the budget can come directly from that.
All right, so here is a little bit zoomed in version of that, the left side of that prior chart. And here I've broken it down into 2 different seed raises, where maybe the first one is with really just an idea or napkin sketch, maybe some really early proof of concept, like what you would develop in the biodesign class, or probably summer extension more realistically. So that's going to be used to develop a prototype, and then eventually something you can put into an animal. In this case, it's an acute study. Then you continue to develop the device and then put it into a longer study to show that this works chronically, assuming this is something that's an implant or has some kind of longer term effect that you're going to want to see in an animal before you go and put it into humans. There's also biocomp testing here. But once you have that animal data, then you can use that as some proof of concept to raise additional seed funding. Maybe you put your cap on your note or safe a little bit higher, and then go to the same investors or new investors to raise this additional seed funding, and then use that to go through your additional device iteration. And in parallel here, so I have, often there is more animal data that's needed, and this can help feed into your FDA IDE process in addition to your human data. So there's a longer term animal study, and then most importantly, for the next rounds investors and for your own just proof that the device is working and that you're on the right track with the design, you do your first in human trial outside the US and then hit that second milestone, which is going to be what you use to raise the Series A.
All right, so once you have the plan, actually it can be really straightforward to build a budget. So the operating plan says what will be done and when, and the budget is basically how much it's going to cost. And so if you've done a good job of laying out the plan, you can, it becomes a bit perfunctory in terms of how you can start to lay out the budget. So you really want to estimate the human first and financial resources required to accomplish these milestones. So Nick had on the screen developing Gen 1 prototype. All right, who's going to do that? Is it you? Is it someone else? Laying down the human resources that are going to execute each of those things. And sometimes those can be outside resources. So it might be a consultant. Sometimes there are outside contractors that are going to build product. Oftentimes, if you're building clinical product, for example, sometimes those things don't get built in-house. Sometimes they do. Nick had outside contractors on there. There was 10993 biocompatibility testing and animal studies, et cetera. So this is a chance to identify who's going to do it and how much each of those things are going to cost. And then once you identify those, you can just literally build them right into a budget. And the good news is that the budget template that we're going to show you is laid out by quarter. So just like the timeline is that you saw, so you can actually lay those same activities into the quarterly budget in the same way that you would in the timeline. And then the last note here is that it can actually be an iterative process. And I would say it is always an iterative process in my experience. So I would say the most common thing is that you lay it all out and it's like, boy, that's a lot of money. It's more than we thought it was going to be. And I think it's going to be really hard to raise that much money right now. So maybe we need to dial back our ambitions or get more creative about how to get there. And so you can actually have a bit of a play back and forth between the budget and the operating plan to dial in something that you feel like is investable. And I touched on a lot of this. Some of the things that are there, it's the people, it's the external resources. Some things that are sometimes easy to forget, but we've got them laid out in the template for you. Facilities, you're gonna have to pay rent somewhere, or maybe you don't if you're creative. Legal, IP, and other consultants, those things can add up quickly. If you have full-time employees, you've got payroll taxes. There's benefits and health insurance, and just legal insurance for the liability insurance for the company, supplies, et cetera. So some of these things that aren't directly in the operating plan can make a dent in the budget as well.
Okay, so we'll dive into an example of this budget template, and we'll send this out as well so you can use it in your own projects. So here's just a general roll up, and this shows the high level categories of the budget. You can see it's laid out by quarter and also has funding rounds at the top, so you can see what's covered under seed and Series A. And it's a little bit different timeline from what I showed in the timeline before. So you can see just the high level categories, things like inside expenses, payroll, preclinical, clinical, and that adds up to your total operating expenses. Okay, so here's the same template we just showed, and you've got different tabs for things like headcount, preclinical, clinical, and inside expenses. And then I'll go into an example of each of those. And so here's the high level summary. You could just see A lot of the expenses here are payroll, kind of depends on which stage of the company you're in. And here's just, you can see this doesn't show up quite the same way in this format, but basically the cash balance, and this is a very low burn company. So there should be, at least in the Excel format, there's a line there, and this should be numbers and not dates, but company is kind of running low on money here, raises the Series A, and then is burning at a very slow rate. In this example, usually you'd see that line going down much more steeply. And then here's kind of the cash burn per quarter here. So the company's burning, and it's tough to say exactly how much based on the data. I think it's something like 100,000 per month in this example, which is kind of a seed stage to maybe early Series A burn level. Then you end up getting a lot higher than that as you keep moving. And here's an example of the just head count. So, and this is just kind of showing you what's what here. These salary levels, I think you'll find, are less than you can actually hire people for in the Bay Area. When you go out looking, I've been shocked many times, kind of how much you have to pay to hire good people. So you'll there again end up burning more cash than you probably expect. The CEO in this case is taking a relatively low salary, kind of seed or early stage salary of 100,000. Then you have 2 engineers, and in this case, probably people right out of college being paid 70 or 80,000. And then you can see kind of how this all adds up to a total payroll expense. This company gives a bonus. Some companies may or may not do that early stage. And there's also benefits you have to factor in. You want to offer your employees things like healthcare. So that's going to add additional costs on top of the base salary. So it's important to factor in those costs. Usually I like to build in a little bit of padding to just make sure we're not going to run over what we're planning. So that means running out of money faster. And then the preclinical tab. So this is just showing a few studies. I think in this case, just one animal study, which costs about $50,000 to run across 2 quarters. And then clinical, you'll find as much as, well, this doesn't have any, well, anyway, you can imagine clinical studies usually cost a lot more than you expect. There's, even for a small person human study, I found myself spending $1 million or $2 million. And then pivotal studies usually are going to cost something more in the tens of millions. And then same for the inside expenses. You can see lots of line items here. There's kind of company activities, education, books, employee expenses, just equipment they need. Lots of travel. When you're doing a clinical study, one thing that really adds up is the travel. You find yourself on the road a lot, and usually it requires a lot more site visits than you expect. The clinical sites really need to be handheld through the process, and you end up having your team out there quite a bit, and it really adds up. There's marketing, and even in the early stage, sometimes you want to do some marketing. You want to have a good positioning of your company, web presence, conferences. You might want to have booths there, or other activities. So even early, that can also be an expense. You have legal, of course, IP in particular. Even though the provisional filing fee is not that high, you end up having to engage patent attorneys, and again, the costs end up being a lot more than you'd expect when you first get into being an entrepreneur. And same with corporate law. Had lots of sticker shock, even going back to the same attorneys again that I worked with 5 years ago, and said, we'll have kind of wondering how their prices doubled between 2018 and now. And then consultants. So, a lot of the things you're going to need: clinical, regulatory, quality. Eventually you bring a lot of those things in-house if you're building the company for the long run. But then in the short term, when you're just getting started, you may not need a full-time person, or you may need expertise that's outside what you have in your company. So let's say you're going to, for example, we went with ZenFlow to Australia for clinical trials. So, and they have great things like a rebate of 40% of all you spend in Australia, which is really a good reason to go there. We had a consultant that specialized in Australia that helped us run our study on the ground. They prevented us from having to always travel to Sydney or Melbourne to support cases. It's nice to have somebody that's right there in Sydney to be able to drive to the site instead of having your team fly 15 hours down there to just go and check on how the data is doing. And then things like accounting, audits add up, lots of office supplies, of course. You have to have a place for people to work. I mean, unless you're totally remote, which very few med tech companies that are busy building physical products are able to be. That's going to be another cost. The rents are high in this area. And then just for R&D, you need lots of stuff for that as well. Other facilities fees, and then things like depreciation, taxes, insurance. And you need insurance for lots of things, from just corporate liability as a whole to clinical trials, product liability. There's lots of different things that you end up getting into. Really helps early on to have people that have somebody that's been through the whole process that could help you get some estimate of what your costs are likely to be in all these different categories. Because it's hard to figure that out just from from Biodesign, not really knowing how this stuff tends to go.
Yeah, and I think this is where your coaches can be really helpful as well. Next, total addressable market. You guys have looked at this in some way before, but now you get to do it in a way that's more precise, because you know what the product is, and you can get a sense of the pricing and factor that in. So you want to look at a few key things here. It's sort of, what's the incidence prevalence, how's it growing, and most importantly, what are the key segments that you're actually targeting. It's not, if it's heart failure, it's not everybody with heart failure. It's, who are the people with heart failure, for whom your product is best going to target. All right, so we have a couple of slides in math. Luckily, this is all middle school math, so you guys will absolutely ace this. But the total addressable market, it's the max number of customer units per year times the ASP, and the ASP is the average selling price. So again, 3 easy steps here for this one as well. The first is figure out what your customer unit is. So that's when a transaction occurs. It could be when a procedure is done and a device gets used. Could be an annual fee, if you're doing software as a service kind of thing. It could be a monitoring event or a sale of capital equipment. So next, you want to figure out what the total number of eligible available customer units are. And so this is how many people are in that market segment that matters to you. And we've already talked about earlier, and you guys should already have a reasonably good sense of how many people could be in that category. And then finally, is what's the price? And so this is where hopefully you've also begun to get a sense for what you can charge here. You've been doing some economic work. So do you want to look at the current landscape to see what's available? If you're developing a drug, it might be a little different. You can look at comparable drugs, et cetera. And that's also true for devices. And if you're software, then it might be a very different metric. So, but this is, we're looking at competitive products can be really helpful. And so with that, Nick, you want to walk them through an example here?
Yeah, so here's an example of a medical device market. So as far as the prevalence, so in this case, there's 40 million patients with a certain disease. And then within that, there are a subset of those patients that have some level of severe disease. It's enough to get some intervention. If you have mild symptoms, often you're not going to go and seek some invasive solution like an implantable device to treat that. And then within that, there's a subset of those patients that are diagnosed and are eligible for this procedure. We'll consider this procedure in a given year. And then within that, there is a subset that gets a treatment for this. So one of your competitive treatments, since you're not on the market yet, they're getting one of these. And depending on the market, that may be, the other solutions may be more or less meeting the clinical needs. So there could be a lot of room to grow the market, or it could be kind of maxed out where there's a bunch of solutions and you're building something that's going to be better for patients or better in some other way, but it's not necessarily going to expand the market. So it's good to know what the situation is and make the case for why it's that way. In this case, there's assuming it should be 1.5 million patients per year, an ASP of somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000. And pricing is not always transparent in med device. So one thing I found is just asking people who are in the space, like reps of competitive companies or doctors who buy the devices or people at hospitals or clinics, to get a sense of what the pricing is for other products. And so the math here is basically 1.5 million patients per year times 2,000 to 4,000 per device for a market size of 3 billion to 6 billion per year. And here's just showing what the revenue in this market is right now, so and how it's been growing over the last several years. So there's a new product in the market that we're using as a comparable that came out a few years ago, and they grew revenue pretty well. So they went from something pretty small up to a few hundred million by year 4. So it's nice to have that as a comparable. It's really helpful for investors who want to match you to some pattern that they've already seen in the past. So basically here, then there's a good case here that if we can be a mature product on the market, we can get to something like 500 million to $1 billion in revenue, depending on how our data looks and how much market it can address.
Okay, so finally, cost of goods and gross margin. So we're talking about revenue, and now we're going to talk about how profitable that revenue is. So it's an important metric for so first, cost of goods sold. So that's how you end up determining your gross margin. So how much does this product or service cost? And it can be important in the near term, so you can price out your near-term budget. Mostly what we're going to be talking today is as a metric of how profitable a business this is going to be. So in the long term, what will that look like? The factors to consider here are raw materials. What's the labor going to cost to build this? If this is sterile, it needs to be sterilized. You know, all products are packaged to some extent. And then there's some manufacturing overhead. For services, you got to think about, you know, how much AWS is going to cost you, or whatever your favorite cloud service, et cetera. So this is, we're almost done with the math here. So another really simple one, but your gross margin is basically what percentage of the sales price is profit. So it's the revenue minus the cost over the revenue. And for the stage of where you guys are, it's appropriate just to think about that in the context of a single unit. So what's the selling price of the unit minus what it costs over the selling price of the unit.
Okay, so here's just a example of cost of goods. So in this case, and this is a little bit more expensive device where the cost of goods is similar to the sales price I was showing you earlier. Usually you want to have them something like, you know, I think 70–80% for a device usually. So the bottom up items that go into this. So you've got bill of materials, basically the stuff that's used to produce this, about $1,800 in this case. And then you've got direct labor, and that also depends on what kind of economies of scale you're going to get with the labor that's used to build the product. That's also important. Where are you building this? Are you building it in the Bay Area where labor is really expensive, or in another part of the world where it's a little bit cheaper? Then you can also have some level of indirect labor add on top of that. And then for most devices, these things people don't always factor in early on, but you should, is things like packaging, sterilization, and shipping to get the product in sterile form to the customer. If there's a contractor, they can actually add a lot of overhead to this, in this case, about 30%. Then you get to this bottom up total of about $3,000. And then looking at other products, again, it helps to benchmark against some of these products, and you can assume if their margins are 80% or so, you can back out from their ASP, if you have that data, what their cost of goods is. And it's nice to be in that same kind of range or even lower if you can get it that way. If you're much higher, then you probably need to find some way to bring your costs down to be competitive in the market. And then this is just the the math behind that. So using the formulas from before, looking at the low estimate and high estimate for the gross margins here. So with the higher end cost of goods, you're at a gross margin about 80%, or at the high estimate or low estimate for the cost, then you're at 90%. So in this case, it's looks pretty viable as far as what you'd want to get this to market and have it be profitable. Michael?
Yeah, so just kind of 60-second wrap up here. So these topics, they're all essential for early stage fundraising. They're also essential for managing the business and planning the business. So these same tools can actually be used to manage the business. There's no magic to running a business. It's all about just having the right tools and processes. And some of those tools are the ones that we just showed. So, all the key tools for managing any startup, you got to have goals, right? What are the goals that we're going to do over this next financing period? The operating plan to meet those goals. So this is the near-term plan we're talking about. What's your hiring plan? What's your budget? And so, those are tools that whether, depending on who your audience is, if it's your team, maybe it's weekly. If it's your board, maybe it's quarterly. But these are the tools that you can use to manage the team. And Nick, if you want to just forward through, one or two of these here. I mean, this is a tool that I've used in early stage, at least two of my early businesses, and it can be a really effective one. Where to align the team. Here's a weekly meeting. We've got our 5 goals up here. We literally start off an all hands meeting doing that. You got some announcements, et cetera, and it allows everybody to be on track with where you're going. Next slide. With that, you can have the operating plan. And so it's, hey, where are we tracking on this? And at some point, you'll end up having a project manager on the team who's using more sophisticated software, but you can check in with the team on whether you're behind or ahead, and make sure that the various contingencies are coming together. And then, of course, the budget that helps you track, and you can start filling in budget to actual. So, in January, you said you would spend $100,000 and you spent 130. Why? Or actually, oftentimes what happens is you said we're going to spend 100,000, you only spend 70, and it looks like a good thing, but oftentimes that's just because you're behind. So that it's actually not a good thing. So anyway, I think that's a wrap for us. But these are really useful tools that are not only important for your presentation and your report that are coming up, but are actually real things that you can take forward.